William Schabas. He's a professor of international law at Middlesex University in the UK. He was the chairman of the 2014 UN Commission of Inquiry into the Gaza War. Professor, thank you so much indeed for your time. How would you categorize Israel's relationship with international law?
Well, it's clear that Israel has been violating international law in terms of the treatment of the occupied territory. I think that's been clear for many, many years. The transfer of settlers into the occupied territories, which is, after all, the spark that began this most recent crisis. It was the attempt to take homes from Palestinians in East Jerusalem, is all a part of that. And it's not only a violation of international law, it's a war crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So this is at the root of it. This is at the beginning of it. It's all Israel's attempts to take more land, more houses from the Palestinians and gradually take over the occupied territory. As for the actual fighting that's going on right now, it's very difficult for an observer thousands of kilometers away to be able to judge whether war crimes are being committed. What we know, of course, is that one way or another, the civilians pay the price for this terrible violence, mainly in Gaza, but also in Israel, because civilians should be immune from armed conflict, and they're not. And it's impossible to have armed conflict in urban areas like Gaza and like the cities of Israel without civilians paying the price.
Benjamin Netanyahu says the International Criminal Court is anti-Semitic and Israel will not cooperate with Fatou Bensouda, the lead prosecutor's investigation into possible war crimes committed by Israel. Did the Israelis cooperate with you in 2014 when you were heading up that UN commission?
We had no official cooperation from Israel and from its representatives, but informally, of course, Israel did attempt to make appearances before the fact-finding commission. They sent people again, on an informal and not an official basis. Of course, we were not allowed into the territory, and being able, because Israel has the key, the gateway to the occupied territories and to Gaza, it was impossible for the fact-finding mission in 2014 and early 2015 to actually conduct investigations in person on the ground. But these days, you can do an awful lot of interviewing using Skype and FaceTime and so on. And so we were not hindered in the way we might have been before we had this technology.
When people see the images of Palestinians protesting, they may see that moment, and some, but not everyone, will understand that these protests are a product of years and years of oppression. The thing is, does that mean that there isn't really any other viable recourse to, say, for example, Palestinians who are being forcibly evicted from their home? I mean, you've said it. Everybody knows it, that under international law, this sort of occupation and these sort of settlements by Israeli settlers are illegal. So what recourse do the Palestinians have as a normal citizen?
I think it's a terrible thing. We watch this. We understand the great frustration that the Palestinians feel. They've been robbed of their homes, they've been robbed of their land, and they are being denied the full right to exercise self-determination. The Western countries continue to invoke the Oslo Accords, which are old and obsolete and not applicable anymore, and yet Palestine doesn't control its territory. Only a few weeks ago, the US-based non-governmental organization, Human Rights Watch, spoke about an apartheid-like regime. And we remember, those of us, at least people of my age, remember the fighting of the South Africans, of the Africans in South Africa for against the white supremacist regime there, born of frustration, a mismatch in terms of the arms and everything. Ultimately, it was unsustainable. And Israel should know that what it's doing and what it has right now is unsustainable. We either have to have a one-state solution in Israel, but one where the Palestinians are given equal rights and are treated equally, where the apartheid-type regime ends, or a two-state solution where Palestinians are given full self-determination. One way or another, this is not sustainable, but it's extremely painful for people outside Israel and Palestine to watch this, and we can only, our heart breaks for the suffering of the Palestinians, both in the occupied territories, in East Jerusalem, but above all in Gaza.
Professor, I'm kind of loath to ask you a political question, but you almost can't get away with it when you're talking about Israel and Palestine. In terms of Israel almost getting away with what it does, is that because of the international support it's getting? Is it as simple as that? If those international supporters would say to Israel, sorry, you have to follow international law, would that completely change the equation?
Well, most of the countries, the European Union, many of the other Western powers have insisted that the Fourth Geneva Convention applies to the occupied territories. A few of them, I should say a few, more than a few of them, have quietly tried to undermine the efforts of the International Criminal Court to address the war crimes, particularly the war crime of transferring settlers into an occupied territory. You know, it's again, the analogy with South Africa is hard to resist. In South Africa, the Western countries, by and large, gave their support to the apartheid regime for many years, and then gradually that began to weaken. And we have to hope that that will weaken too. Of course, Israel has a powerful military, an unbeatable military in many respects in that area. And but the isolation is what it needs. And unfortunately, last year, just about a year ago, the Israeli regime was greatly encouraged by Trump's shift in the American position. We're all waiting anxiously to see whether Biden is going to roll back from that, because that position has changed in several respects. And it was a terrible encouragement to the Israeli regime, a terrible blow to the Palestinians. Palestinians have also been deserted by some of the Gulf states who were traditional supporters. And this too has weakened them. So this is a desirable change. And hopefully, I mean, what has to happen is that Israel has to reach that understanding that the apartheid regime in South Africa did in 1990, is that they can't go on like this. And this has to change, and it has to be a dramatic political change. If I can, I just want to go back on one other point. You mentioned that Israel, or that the prime minister has accused the International Criminal Court of being anti-Semitic. This is just a slander. This is totally unfair, and there's no basis for saying it. All that the International Criminal Court is doing is exercising its jurisdiction, and its jurisdiction includes the territory of Palestine. But the International Criminal Court is conducting investigations in many parts of the world. There's no basis for any accusation of anti-Semitism. It's a vile slander.
Professor William Schabas, we very much appreciate your time. Thank you.